Hey everyone. If you have kids going to college soon, you do not want to miss this episode. I start by talking with Dr. Jason Kilmer about a study that describes the placebo effect of alcohol in the college environment. This will change everything you think about alcohol. Then we're joined by Rich Lucey, and the three of us have a truly amazing conversation that all parents will get something from. Enjoy. So, one of the things I had heard, Dr. Kilmer, is about a research study that you had done with a bar setting where college kids came into the bar and half were served, I think they were over 21, but half were served drinks with alcohol and half were served drinks without alcohol. Did I hear that right?
There's pieces of it. The
Okay.
person and the brains behind all of that was Dr. Alan Marlatt. And Alan
Okay.
was really, really interested in researching expectancies and is
Okay.
credited with developing the balanced placebo design. People had heard about the term placebo, especially with medicine, things like a sugar pill. And he said, if we really want to know what alcohol does, don't we have to balance that design even more? So he would run conditions where people were told they were getting alcohol and get alcohol free drinks. He would even do research where people were told they were getting no alcohol, but actually got it. They were all over 21, as you note. They all signed consent forms that said, if you serve me alcohol, I give permission for that. There were steps taken to certainly make sure that transportation was figured out and so on. And when people think they've been drinking, even when they haven't, all the social stuff they say they get from alcohol happens. They get more talkative, more outgoing, more funny, more flirty, even though they haven't been drinking. When people don't know that they're getting alcohol, but actually get it, they don't act any different. The physiological effects of alcohol kick in, but the attributions they make have nothing to do with the fact that they were drinking. Alcohol is a depressant, so it depresses or slows down the central nervous system, so people get tired, and they blame it on a long day of school or a long day at work. They flush, and they blame it on the temperature of the room. They get clumsy, and they're like, sorry, clumsy.
Yeah.
So Alan showed that there was a huge impact of expectancy on alcohol's social effects, such that those social effects are more due to what people think they're getting than what they're actually consuming.
That to me is remarkable. I mean, it says so many things about people's capacity to connect and socialize and be with each other. And I mean, it's almost something I feel like we want to tell young people. It's like you're more creative, without it. And you're gonna be more excited and more social without it. Is that going too far or
I think what's really hard, I work with college students, and every once in a
yeah.
while I get asked to present to high school students or middle school students, and I have so much respect for people who do that on a day to day basis. When I ask, and I don't ask even what they've experienced, I ask words like, what are the ways that you hear people say alcohol affects you in a good way positively? The list that middle school students generates is amazing to me because they've heard it from parents, caregivers,
Right.
guardians. They've seen it in TV commercials. They've seen portrayals on movies, TV shows. They have a sense. People who've never touched alcohol in their life can say, if I drink, here's what's going to happen. I will be the life of the party. I'll be less shy.
Yeah.
The science is showing that's not coming from the alcohol.
That's amazing. And really the alcohol, I think you just said, can be working against that because it
Oh,
is a
absolutely.
depressant.
Well, a depressant depresses or slows down the central nervous system. Someone won't necessarily get sad,
Right.
but it will, you know, there are very clear physiological effects of alcohol. All of alcohol is not, in quotes, in your head, but the social and interpersonal things seem to be. And obviously, I could have spent forever talking about Dr. Marlatt's research. I answered that as quickly as I could, but you don't even need research to prove that in some ways. We see it with other substances. We see it with coffee. Someone takes one sip and they're like, there we go. Now I'm awake. And it's like, that's impossible. You had one
Right.
sip, but there are these strong placebo effects.
That's amazing. Awesome. Thank you so much. Mr. Lucy,
Oh,
hello.
Rich
Can you
Lucey.
hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, let me do a quick introduction. So, on today's podcast, we are really excited to talk to Dr. Jason Kilmer, who's at the University of Washington, and Richard Lucey, who's with the DEA. They're going to be talking to us today about college. about the substance environment on college campuses and about how, as parents, we can begin thinking about this transition. It's a pretty big deal. So, welcome, gentlemen.
Great to be
Thank you
here,
very
Debbie.
much.
Great. Good to have you both. And let me just start by saying I'm basically a layperson. I'm a parent for the most part. And before I started working in public health, I had no idea that there was all of the science and research and community engagement relative to substance use and underage substance use. And the two of you are really rock stars in that world. And so just spend a minute and introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your work. Dr. Kilmer, if you wanted to start.
Sure, you can call me Jason. I'm Jason Kilmer. I'm an associate professor in psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of Washington. And I'm part of a team that for years has been doing research on college student alcohol use, cannabis use, other drug use, but I think importantly, approaches how we work with students on those issues. So a large part of my research is around developing, implementing, and evaluating prevention and intervention efforts for substance use.
Perfect. That's great. Rich, how about you?
Yeah, so I love being in the same breath considered a rock star with Jason. First of all, can I just say that? I'm not sure what our band name is going to be. We'll have to think of that. But
We're going
yeah,
to come up with a band name. Let's do
yeah.
this.
So my entire career, now it's 33-ish years, has been in the government space. Started my government career in my home state of New York, and I started my federal career in 1999. I'm on my third federal agency. I started at the U.S. Department of Education in the Office of Safe and Drug-Free Schools. I was there for 9 years. I think that's actually where I first met Jason. Following that stint, I then went to Health and Human Services. I was the special assistant to the director of the Center for Substance Abuse Prevention, Fran Harding, for 8 years. And then I was recruited to come work for DEA in 2016. So actually, a couple weeks ago, I just celebrated my 8th anniversary here at DEA. I say all that because my entire government career has been in the prevention space. It's been in working in preventing alcohol and other drug misuse among youth and young adults, with a particular emphasis among college students.
And let me just ask real quick. So I don't think most people think DEA and think prevention. So is there a whole aspect of the DEA or department that focuses on that? Tell us a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for asking that because we get that question a lot. And when I do my presentations, I have a slide right up front that asks that question. Why is DEA in the prevention space? I'm always quick to answer. First and foremost, we are an enforcement agency. That is our primary mission. However, in 1985, one of our special agents, Enrique Camarena, was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered in Guadalajara, Mexico. And that really raised for the general public the consciousness of the dangers of drug trafficking and the work that the 5,000 or so special agents do around, not only the US, but around the world. And it really was right around that time that we started to beef up our education and prevention aspect. And all since that time, we have built this portfolio of resources, publications, websites, presentations that are not only for the general public, but for some very specific segments of the population, including professionals who work in higher education. And that was one of the reasons I was recruited to come here. DEA traditionally interacts with colleges and universities on two fronts: recruitment fairs, when they do talk to students about a potential career at the DEA. And then the other end of the spectrum, the takedowns, because drug trafficking, unfortunately, does happen on and around college campuses. So several years ago, DEA really wanted to get in that middle space and say, look, we know 18 to 25-year-olds have some of the highest rates of drug use. They also have some of the lowest rates of seeking help. College students make up a significant portion of that age group. So what is it we can do to help support the professionals like Jason and his colleagues all around the country in the work that they're doing? And we really have created a wealth of resources for them. It might be a few resources, but they are mighty. That's the way I look at it.
Love that. Thank you for that explanation. I think that's very orienting for parents that may be listening to us. Okay, so let me back up for a minute and just say, I've had a few kids go to college. It's a very exciting time for parents and kids. It's an anxiety producing time. All kinds of issues get activated during this transition. And maybe we just start generally by talking about the transition itself before we even focus on alcohol or drug use in college. Is there anything you would tell us as parents about this time and how to perceive it, perhaps?
I can just say quickly that one of the things we always try and make clear is that parents and guardians still are super influential. There's so often the sense of, well, they're in college now, they don't want to listen to me. They listen to you. And there's large national surveys that actually quit asking questions because there was nothing new coming. We kept saying, no, keep asking the question. They would ask college students, here are all the possible places you can get your health information. Where do you get it? How believable do you see the source? The number one place students get their health information is the internet, but it's way down at the bottom in believability. Behind health center medical staff, health educators, and parent faculty and their coursework are parents and guardians. They're up there. They're up there in the top of places that they see as believable. And parents are number two behind the internet in terms of where people get their health information. So I think the important thing is to keep those lines of communication open about not just substance use, but about how they're doing, checking in. Depending on what college someone goes to, it can be a real big shift in terms of what they're used to. I grew up in a town of 17,000 people and went to a school more than double that size. And so I think just being aware for some of those issues that could come up and making it okay to communicate about those is really important.
Rich, anything else you would add to that?
Says somebody who does not work on a campus, and I don't have that same experience that Jason and others have, but I think all the feels from my experience in working with folks like Jason, for students, it's exciting. It can be anxiety. There's nervousness. There could be that sense of independence. It's just, I say, all the feels. And, I think you embrace that, quite honestly, and acknowledge it. We say accept how you're feeling, but it's all those same things for moms and dads and caregivers. So I think it could be heightened because their son or daughter's going off to college. And let's presume it's miles and miles and miles away. It's not just a 10
Mhm.
mile away college. There's that anxiety producing too, that they're not going to be here. We're not going to be able to really monitor what they're doing. And so it's anxiety producing.
I think I want to ask you both, kind of diving into the drugs and alcohol, questions along the lines of how much is out there and what are college kids or kids walking into on college campuses? Are there use rates or stats that are out there? I know parents kind of are curious. I work with some high school kids that are really curious as well. What am I going to experience when I get there? Is there a way to frame that? Go ahead,
Super.
Dr. Kilmer.
Certainly. So we've had long established rates of use. And I think what I'm going to say is two things. One, the rates are out there. And we also know that there are such significant misperceptions of what happens on college campuses. And when students think, quote, everyone drinks, they're probably going to drink. When people think, quote, everyone drinks heavily, they might be more likely to drink heavily. And the data tell that's simply not the case. The best data set we have nationwide for college students is the Monitoring the Future study out of the University of Michigan. And past year alcohol use by college students is, in their most recent survey, 80.5% of students say they drank at least once in the past year. To me, there's two really important conclusions to draw from that statistic. And one is the flip side. 1 in 5 students do not drink. So whether they are students that haven't touched alcohol their whole life, if it's students in recovery, it's students who have tried alcohol, but it's been more than a year, it's really important for those students to know they're not alone and to feel supported in the decision to not drink. The other thing to realize is, 80.5% of students aren't over 21. So we do have some underage students that report alcohol use. Now, past year use is a very broad definition. If you look at past 30-day use, that number shrinks to 62.5%. But one of the questions we've asked for decades is, have you had 5 or more drinks in a row at least once in the past 2 weeks? And we look at that as a risk or indicator of heavy episodic, or in quotes, binge drinking. 27.7% of college students say yes. That is a very consistent number. We have a lot of faith in that number. What do you see in every movie, TV show, social media? The 5 or more. What do most students do? Not that. 72.3% of students either do not drink at all, or if they make the choice to drink, have 1, 2, 3, or at the most 4 when they drink. So I think that's really, really important. If someone says, I really want to fit in, I mean, the person who chooses to not drink at all or hold a drink in their hand the whole night, probably doing what most students are doing. And those misperceptions can unfortunately translate to such direct associations, people's own decisions, own behavior, and even consequences they experience.
That's amazing, and I hope people really hear that. That perception is so powerful. We look at that monitoring the future data in the high schools as well.
Yeah,
So many kids are not using and or haven't used in the last 30 days, and everyone thinks everyone's using.
yeah.
So that is really powerful and empowering. It makes me think about, can you get through that fraternity and to a lesser degree sorority rush without drinking? And I guess maybe those numbers say that you can.
The answer to me is a resounding yes. And I think that one of the things that gets encouraged is that parents and caregivers and guardians know the data, so that
Right,
when a student says, well, everyone uses, they really, really, really don't. And
right.
the more we can correct misperceived norms, the more that's associated with people's own behavior.
Well, that is great news. Knowing that sounds really important. Are there other strategies as a freshman showing up to college? Anything a parent should know? Anything a kid should think about as they're heading that direction?
Well, so what we do know, research has shown that first 6 weeks of college is a pretty high risk period of time. And part of the reason is we've known that college students, it goes back to what I mentioned before, they have this newfound independence when they're not at home with mom and or dad, and they have new social groups, new friends, new opportunities, good and bad. And so prevention professionals that are working on this issue around the country really zero in on that first 6 weeks. Students are kind of feeling themselves out. As I said, they're making
Okay.
new friends, getting involved in new social groups and such. So I think it's just important for parents and others to be aware that it's a high risk period of time. There are other touch points throughout the year. Unfortunately, those are typically centered around holidays, Halloween, and St. Patrick's Day, that have become drinking holidays, and individual
Right.
campuses with their own traditions that have high alcohol and drug use associated with them. So I think knowing when some of the high risk periods are is important to understand.
I think I've heard that term, high use event. Talk
Mhm.
to us more about that. And Jason, what else would you add in what to look for or think about?
Well, I think Rich is right that when you look at these different high risk events, that can vary based on where you are. It can be, there's some research that shows that if you go to a school that has a strong sports culture, think of work that's been done even around football, that schools with a strong football culture, both home and away, football games tend to be heavier drinking weekends. So I think it's just really realizing that it's not that, in quotes, everyone drinks, and it's certainly not that everyone drinks heavily all the times, but there are these instances that it does go up. To your previous question, what I was going to say is that I think one of the other things that it's important to know, Dan Eisenberg did research screening college students for depression. And when they flagged as being at risk for depression, he asked them, do you feel like you need help? When they said yes, he asked, did you get help? When they said yes, he said, woo. When they said no, he tried to look at what was associated with students not getting help. And the number one students didn't get help. They didn't know where to go. We can fix that. And so when a student calls home and is like, I'm having a tough time, what is said next can go a long, long way to making sure that dots can get connected. I have met with seniors who are like, we have a counseling center. And I'm like, you walked by it to get to my office. They didn't know. And so I think
Yeah.
that making sure resources that are available to students, making sure that parents and guardians are in a position to make sure that they're aware of those too. So that
Right.
if that's not on their students' radar, they can help put it there.
That's interesting. Sometimes it's the simplest things, isn't it? Just a little bit of awareness. But I remember when my first kid went off to school and finding the health center, like we didn't think about it at first.
Sure.
And then her roommate, it was their, fourth child to show up in college. And that mom pulled me aside and said, okay, you need to find the health center. You need them to sign that HIPAA form so that the college can talk to you about anything they might go through. And I was like, what's the HIPAA? What is that? So I any thoughts about what I'm talking about, or could you make it more clear for parents?
Well, there's a couple forms. There's the HIPAA
Oh,
form, there's the FERPA form. It's all about privacy. And especially once people are 18, they're adults and they are the keeper of their own privilege when it comes to confidentiality. So if a student says, I want my parent to know what's going on, they have to get permission to do that. So if a parent calls and said, is my student in the counseling center? The counseling center certainly can't answer that. Did my student go to the health center? They can't answer that. If students sign forms that give the green light to do that, they can.
they can
I love that you got coached by a parent that was like, here's what you got to do. So
answer.
I do think that's a good thing. Good things happen when you listen to the people that want to give advice. So when you're doing those parent visitation days, the ones that have had a student or two go through there, that can be
Yeah.
a really helpful resource.
Right. And it's good as a parent, then we're saying, know where the health center is, know what the services are. I kind of did if you want to go to the school, you have to sign this form or we're not going to pay for it kind of a thing. So that was my approach. Other parents may choose other things. And some kids may just not sign the form. But knowing what the services are is still a good thing, is what I'm hearing. And you can at least suggest to your kid, if you feel like they're struggling or they need help, or they say categorically that they need help, here's where remember that you're supposed to go.
I'll say again, parents are the number 2 source of health information behind the internet, and they're fourth most
Okay.
believable. That was from the National College Health Assessment out of the American College Health Association. They asked it every year and they took it out of the survey because the findings were always the same. I
Oh,
loved that they kept it in every year because I cited it all the time. So I was the annoying person that was like calling them and going, put it back in the survey. But, it is true. They consistently showed how genuinely influential parents, guardians, and caregivers are.
awesome. Okay. Do you think parents need to be more vigilant if their kids are going to college in recreational legal cannabis states? Any difference?
I want to apologize if I'm diving in. Rich, if you want to go
No,
first, I'll
Jason, I
yield
was
to
going to
you.
punt it to you because you're a great example in Washington State. So please, what has been the experience there?
So thank you for saying that. I'm principal investigator of our state's young adult health survey. We've been collecting data from 18 to 25-year-olds from before retail stores opened in 2014 and every year since. We just celebrated a decade of data, which sounds a little nerdy to celebrate, but we celebrated a decade of data. When we look at brand new cohorts of 18 to 25-year-olds from pre-implementation of legalization and all of the time points after, when we look at sources of cannabis use for 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, one of the sources that's actually increasing is parents and guardians. In fact,
Mhm.
in the most recent administration of our survey, parents and guardians were the third most common source of cannabis for 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. I'll say two things. One, we hear way too many parents say, and I quote, well, I used when I was younger and I turned out fine. They used different stuff. In the
Right.
70s, concentration of THC in cannabis was 1.5%. In the 80s, 2-3%. In the 90s, 4-5-6%. Smokable flower in my state ranges on average 20 to 30% THC. Concentrates, wax, hash oil, what people use for dabbing, 60 to 90%. When people say, in quotes, it's just weed or it's natural, it stopped being just weed a long time ago. And the levels we're seeing don't occur in nature. So I worry that when a parent says, well, I used when I was younger and I turned out fine, they don't realize that what's out there now is a vastly different product. The other thing is we have such clear associations between cannabis use and academic outcomes. The more often a student uses cannabis, the lower the grade point average tends to be. The more classes they skip, the less likely they are to graduate on time if they make it to graduation. If a parent is paying for a penny of their student's tuition, they probably wouldn't want to see their student using cannabis. And so the fact that parents are that third most common source for 18, 19, 20-year-olds, we see that as concerning. We also know there's big associations between cannabis use and mental health. So parents are our partners in prevention, and we do what we can to make sure they're aware of what the science says so they can help support prevention messages and not accidentally undermine them.
Along those lines, one of the most common thing that I will hear from parents is, well, they need to learn how to drink before they go to college. And so I'm letting them drink at home and we're taking the keys and keeping them safe. And whereas I I can really appreciate the deep desire that might be defined as safety in that statement and coming from a parent and a parent wanting to do what's best for their kid. But I think it's probably not the safest option. But what would you say about that mindset or that belief out there for parents?
Yeah, I can say that. So this is an age-old issue. This is not new. This is not new thinking. I've heard this when I first started in the field in the early 90s. And it actually ties back to your previous question around the usage rates, say, in the legalized states or not. Two things I want to
Mhm.
mention. One is in our field, we are in the business of trying to change norms. And if the norm within a family, within a community, within a campus, if the norm is a rather lackadaisical or lenient or passive approach to drug use, we tend to see higher rates of use when the norm is more lenient, if you will. We also know, again, taking the parent kind of out of the equation, we always try to prevent the early onset of use because by doing that, we tend to alleviate problems with drug use later in life. So the more we can, regardless if it's mom or dad saying it's okay for you to pop a beer in the basement because you're in our house, you still have set the norm early and you have set an expectation early. So there's that piece of it. The other thing I wanted to mention, I think it's regardless of the state you're in when it comes to marijuana, but this is true of all drugs. When the perception of harm is low in using a particular drug, we tend to see the usage rates go up. And we have seen that
Okay.
over time with marijuana. And it's tied, yes, to the legalized states, but we know that, again, going back to norms and perceptions, they have changed over the last 10 to 15 years, that it's a plant. Therefore, it must be natural. Or it must be more benign
Right.
than, say, alcohol or cocaine or heroin or what have you. We know that as the perception of harm goes down, and the perception of harm has gone down significantly when it comes to marijuana, usage rates will tend to go up. And so that's something else that we keep an eye on when we look at the data. And I'm glad that Jason mentioned the monitoring the future data, as well as the National College Health Assessment, because those are the two that I tend to pay the most attention to because they paint the national picture. That's what I present on. I always say to campuses, hopefully you're doing your own local data, local assessments, because that's what's going to help drive what you're going to focus on in terms of drug use rates and which drugs and where they're using.
If you don't mind, I would add to that.
Please.
I look at our state, we have our Healthy Youth Survey that they give to 6th, 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. 10th graders, sophomores in high school, when you ask them, the kids, do you think your parents think it's wrong if you use marijuana or not wrong? When kids say, I think my parents would think it's wrong, 13% nevertheless say they've used marijuana in the last 30 days. When kids say, my parents don't care, 59% of those sophomores in high school have used in the past 30 days. That role of parental permission does not go away when they get to college. And so I always quote Amelia Area, who says, this is not an area where practice makes perfect. Starting early is a risk factor for onset of addiction, as Rich mentioned. When the message is, my parents cool with me doing this, they're more likely to drink heavily when they get to college. And especially if a student is drinking pretty heavily the summer before they go to college, if they develop tolerance, if they can, in quotes, hold their liquor, there's a lot of research that shows there's a large environmental component to that, such that if they go to a campus, the tolerance they developed over the summer won't follow them there. And in those first 6 weeks that Rich alluded to earlier, when they go out and drink, it could hit them way, 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 way harder than it did the 3 months prior to going to college. There are a lot of reasons to not have a model like that.
Is there anything else you can tell us about that last point, that like how drinking 5 beers over the summer might not translate to drinking 5 beers in the fall at your
I mean,
college campus?
the short version, and
Yeah.
stop me if this is too long, but the short version is, look at Pavlov in classical conditioning.
Okay.
Pavlov taught us that we can make a dog salivate when a bell rings. You put food in front of a dog, it salivates. Put food in front of a dog, ring a bell, it looks at you funny. But if you keep doing food and a bell over and over and over, in time, ring the bell, the dog salivates. The bell becomes a conditioned stimulus that can elicit salivation. If you always drink in your parents' lake house or basement or deck, and you do that all summer long, how is that deck, how is that basement, how is that lake house functionally any different than that bell to Pavlov's dog? It's not. They're cues associated with the presentation of a drug to the body that slows the body down. We know about the concept of maintaining a set point, homeostasis. And in physiology, there's something called the opponent process theory. It says if you shove the body one way, the body shoves back the other. Jack up the heat, we sweat. Make it cold, we shiver. If you have a drug like alcohol that slows down the central nervous system, and you keep drinking around the same set of environmental cues, in time, those cues tell the body, here comes the drug. So the second we go into that basement with our friends, the body goes, okay, well, we're drinking. And knowing that alcohol's coming, the central nervous system makes an anticipatory response in the direction opposite the way the drug acts. They drink the same amount they drank a month ago, and they don't feel it the same way. Because even though objectively they're at the same blood alcohol level, subjectively they don't feel it in the same way. So what do? They use one more. Especially if that moves to shots. Someone started the summer drinking 2 shots, now they're up to 5. The body is making that anticipatory response. So all of a sudden, if you go to a new environment, those cues that tell the body we're going to drink aren't there. If they slam those same number of drinks, the full-fledged impact of what they consume could hit them, and hit them devastatingly hard. We've gotten to the point where we can predict overdose as a function of change in environment. And this has huge implications for students studying abroad who've developed tolerance. The tolerance they have at school won't follow them when they walk off the plane. But it also has huge implications for students that have developed tolerance that can hold their liquor during the summer, because that will not follow them to campus the first time.
I'm speechless. That was an excellent explanation, and we're gonna need to make that a little clip and make sure that it gets out there.
I can
That
send
it
you a QR code. Rich and I have a good friend, Susie Bruce, at the Gordy Center at the University of Virginia. And Susie said, our students found you talking about this on the internet. And I'm like, wait, what? I didn't know I was out there. But she said that the students believe it. And they said, could you make a freestanding explanation of that? They made an animated version of me that will haunt your dreams. Frankly, it's terrifying. But it's my audio, and just as long as you don't look at the guy, it tells the story with some graphics pretty effectively. So I can send you that link when we're done.
Please do. That is fantastic. I feel like one of the things we're talking about here is basically human brain development, and we know we need every parent out there to become more brain development savvy, and so many are in different ways, and there's a lot of good resources. But what I'm hearing you say is you can't hack it when it comes to drugs and alcohol. You're not going to be able to get them better prepared to handle drugs and alcohol at any point in time during that developmental phase. And what we want our kids to do is to really have the brain development experience and really evolve and make them more functioning human adults, where they can connect socially and they can problem solve and they can have fun and they can feel good about themselves. And a lot of that's adolescent started brain development experience, and we just don't want to get in the way of that. My guess is, tell me if I'm right, if we can let that brain keep developing as much as we can, if they did start to drink when they're 19 or 20 or 21 and they do start to have problems, is it possible that they can, correct or get on a different path more easily if they've waited to use, or is that unknowable?
Well, what we know from our good friends at NIDA, they're the ones who really came out with the brain research. And what I'll say is really aren't any easy answers, Debbie, but here's at a bottom line what we know. The female brain develops pretty much fully at age 21. For males, us guys, it takes longer, and it's not till age 25. And so I think to your point, I say it goes back to that early onset. The longer we can delay the onset of not only use, but the high risk use, the better off we are, because it's rare. And Jason, I know you've studied this much more than I have. It's rare for, say, a 30-year-old to all of a sudden drink heavily and develop a substance use disorder if they hadn't started drinking in such a way earlier. So again, it goes back to the norms and it goes back to the behavior issue. To your point on brain development, it is a crucial piece of evidence in our toolbox, but I don't really know how much students want to listen to that. I don't know if the brain game or your brain's not fully developed, how you say that without coming across as either condescending or from a practical perspective. But Jason, I'm sure you've looked at the research a lot more in different ways, certainly, than I have. I know enough to be dangerous on this, but Jason's looked at it a lot more closely.
I would reinforce what you said. There is very good reason to delay initiation of use. And the longer a person waits, that we see likelihood of developing a substance use disorder go down. There's the developmental issues that Rich mentioned. There's lots of good reasons to delay initiation of use.
And is possibly coming out of problematic use more efficiently or effectively one of the reasons to delay as well? Or am I making that up? So I didn't start till I was 19. I'm 21. I'm starting to drink problematically. Is it going to be easier for me to get on a track to recovery, or we don't know?
It's so hard to make generalizations with that because any one
Okay.
person's situation is different. And I think that there's a lot of people make big decisions about changing and stopping substance use with no formal intervention at all. So we
Right.
certainly know about the people that engage in counseling or recovery programs, things like this. There are many people that make changes on their own. I do think
Okay.
that because the younger that you are, that you might initiate use, the more there is that risk of developing a substance use disorder. That does make it more challenging potentially for someone lifelong. So I
Right.
think if someone waits later, if someone says the reason why I use blank is because it helps me relax, theoretically, the older someone is, the more they've learned and identified other coping strategies as well. So if they decide, well, it's not working for me as well anymore, do they have other coping strategies they can use instead?
Okay, because I'm curious. From a college policy perspective, do you think the NCAA or policies in college athletic departments are protecting our kids that are athletes, or do you think it's just the same as the general population?
Part of my job involves doing work with all of our intercollegiate athletes at my own campus, and per NCAA requirements, they get a lot more, I think. They get a lot more as sophomores, juniors, seniors, certainly beyond first year students. They get a lot more alcohol and other drug prevention content than many non-student athletes would. I think that the fact that the NCAA has a list of banned substances, the fact that there can be testing for things like that, and
Yeah.
the fact that the NCAA does what it can to make sure that there are these expectations and requirements for prevention for all teams does mean that it's not one and done. It's not a program you got when you were an incoming first year student and never again. I mean, I've worked with teams where fifth year seniors are like, I get to see you again, fifth time. And it's like, I feel like I should give
Yeah.
them something, right? A
Yeah.
prize. But I think that's important that there is that commitment to the health and well-being of student athletes.
Okay. That sounds great. And I guess what you just referenced is those lots of times college campuses will have a student do a drug and alcohol program before they show up their
Yes.
freshman year. Is that pretty common in all campuses at this point, or is that still here and there? Do we know?
And nobody's capturing that information to
I mean,
really, to really know. It's a generalization as to whether or not it's increasing, decreasing, or not. To the athlete's point, we know of schools
Mhm.
where all student athletes are being screened for an alcohol or other drug issue before they even
Mhm.
step on the field or the court or the bowling center or whatever. So to Jason's point about student athletes, I will say that they are probably getting more resources because there's been a lot of focus on student athletes, their mental health, their substance use rates. Some of them will say they are held to a higher standard, that there isn't a double standard, that there is a higher standard. And not many people know this about me, but I was a coach of a community college team back in the day. And I always said to my team, look, you're wearing the school's name on your back. And so I hold you to a different standard when we go to away games and things like that. So that was well before the resources that are a lot deeper and broader, fortunately, I think, for these student athletes.
So that's great. So as parents, we can know we've got that in our corner if we've got athletes headed to school. So is there anything else that you would share with us, either techniques that parents should engage in if they think their kid's having a problem, or any other just, this is an exciting time, let's really embrace it and make it great for all of us, kind of a message?
We're really big fans of collegeparentsmatter.org. It is a free resource. People can go to that, they can click on topics, and it has literally so much of what we talked about today. Alcohol, cannabis, 21st birthdays, high-risk events, Halloween, you name it. And it gives tips and strategies for how to talk with students on these issues. And it's just a fantastic resource. A group in Maryland developed that, and all the way from the other coast, we've really admired that from afar and think it's an amazing resource.
Fabulous.
I would just say two things. One, as far as a resource goes, we have partnered with the Elks and their drug awareness program over the last several years on a podcast series called Awkward Conversations. And in season 2 and season 3, we had 2 episodes that were 2-parters that focused specifically on preventing drug misuse among college students. And this podcast series really had parents in mind. So if you go to campusdrugprevention.gov into our video series, you can find the Awkward Conversations Hub and see all of the past 3 seasons worth of video podcasts. But parents specifically might want to take a look at that. The first year I did it, Jason's and my good friend and colleague, Dr. Sally Lanowski from UMass Amherst. Last year, I did a different episode. It was with Dr. Allison Smith, another good friend and colleague of ours in this space. So there's that right there. But I would just make that plug for not all parents feel this way, but your job's not done. And I say that as a non-parent. But, when we talk about this is also good advice for other caregivers. I have nieces and nephew. My, youngest niece is going off to college this fall. And I talked to my sister, her mom, about orientation. Keep your ears and eyes open. You are the buyer. This is a product. Ask when you're on the tour, the tour's over, but when you have orientation and you're there dropping her off, go talk to the counseling center staff. Go talk to the health center staff. Talk to whoever's bringing you around, because it goes back to the beginning of this conversation, the health resources and getting to know what's there. My niece is going on both an academic and an athletic scholarship, so I feel like she's going to be in really good hands in terms of resources. But,
Yes.
I'll laugh and she'll laugh, and when she watch, I know my sister will watch this, but I will say I haven't had the big uncle talk with her yet about college, and I will, just because it could be a scary time, but it can be an exciting time. And I think that, as I said earlier, you need just to understand that.
And that, Rich Lucey, is the name of our band, Big Uncle Talk.
There we go. And if you want to lead that in,
I
if
love
you want to lead
that.
that into the podcast, I'm all for it.
I
We'll get
am.
t-shirts made.
Yeah, you were far too complimentary with the introductions. I get blushing when you say rockstar, but Rich, that's it. Big Uncle Talk. Let's do this.
Big Uncle Talk.
That's fantastic. If we
I'm having my
if we
Big Uncle
haven't
Talk this summer.
if we haven't already said it, Rich and Jason have worked together a lot over the last couple of decades.
We have a pretty good
And
rapport.
I think the first thing I heard, yes, Jason and Rich's excellent adventure in prevention, I heard at one point in time. So this is just the next phase, the Big Uncle Talk Band. It's a good one. Thank you both so much for joining us today. I think this is going to be so valuable, and so many of us are going to get a lot out of this. So thank you for sharing your time and your expertise.
Thank you for doing what you do.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. And we want to remind listeners that the Talk They Hear You materials, including this podcast, can be found at the Talk They Hear You website. It is Talk They Hear You, all spelled out, no spaces, .samhsa.gov. SAMHSA is spelled SAMHSA.gov. Please share this site and this podcast with your friends. The more we can be in conversation with each other, the better for everyone, especially our kids. Also, we would like to hear from you. Would you like to be on the show? Do you have any stories to share or tips and techniques that have worked or not worked for you as a parent? Do you have any questions for us or feedback on topics or improvements of any kind? We know your input will help us design the most useful interviews possible. Please contact us at whatparentsaresaying@gmail.com for any of this. Again, all spelled out, whatparentsaresaying@gmail.com. This podcast is brought to you by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Talk They Hear You is a national prevention campaign that aims to help parents and caregivers talk with their kids about the dangers and risks of underage drinking and other drug use. As a reminder, the views expressed here are not necessarily those of SAMHSA or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.